Did you know that Ayrton Senna's most famous statement wasn't entirely true? Yes, Senna's much-loved phrase where he said, "If you no longer go for the gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver." In this video, I reveal the truth behind this quote and how it relates to one of the most controversial moments in F1 history. If you're unaware of the full story, you may find the details quite shocking. Ayrton Senna is arguably Formula One's greatest driver of all time. He won 3 titles in his lifetime, and there's no doubt he would have won more. Whenever someone brings up his name, he's universally loved and adored. But what if I told you that when he was alive, he wasn't? That when he was alive, there were people who questioned his character. There were people who questioned his driving style, and there were people who questioned his tactics. Not just fans, highly regarded people. One of those is a 3-time world champion who went face to face with Senna and called him out to his face.
And I respect totally your ability. You're the fastest Grand Prix driver in the world. I respect that. But I have to speculate that it can't all be right, that you have this many collisions, if you like. Whether it be with back markers or whether it be with lead changes, it just happens too often. Don't you question yourself?
If you don't know the full extent of the Senna story, then you're seriously missing out. But before we get to the quote, which was in 1990, we need to rewind back to the 80s again, back 3 years, to 1987, the year that Michael Jackson released his Bad album, the year Dirty Dancing was a box office hit, making $170 million worldwide. Ronald Reagan was the president of the US, and in Formula One, the top driver goes by the name of Alain Prost. Some people argue that Prost was better than Senna. Senna had the flair and the speed over one lap, but Prost was a thinker with his smooth and consistent driving style on race day. He also made less mistakes than Senna. Every great needs a great rivalry, and Senna had a great rivalry with Prost. In Formula One, it's not often that 2 greats get the chance to race each other. There's various factors that get in the way to stop fans getting what they really love to see. The best drivers on the grid going wheel to wheel with each other. You just have to look at recent times. You have Max Verstappen leading in Red Bull, Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso behind him wishing they had equal machinery. Before that, there was Lewis Hamilton with the dominant Mercedes, Sebastian Vettel with the Red Bull, Michael Schumacher with his Ferrari, the list goes on and on. But in the late 80s, Formula 1 fans were blessed with 2 drivers not only being able to race head to head, but to do so for consecutive years. The Senna versus Prost rivalry is like a story straight out of Hollywood. In fact, it's surprising that it's not been made into a movie. I think the main reason it hasn't is because there's so much to cover. The producers would have had to make a trilogy to even explain what happened. But don't worry, I'll try and explain the rivalry in a few minutes. It's important to know this backstory that leads to Senna's quote. Prost was a McLaren driver in the 80s and won back-to-back titles with them in 1985 and 1986. In 87, Prost convinced McLaren that they should sign Senna for the 88 season. Prost was very close with the McLaren owners and was comfortable in McLaren. He won championships with them, he knew the team well, he was confident he could beat anyone who was his teammate there. Senna wasn't the only change from McLaren in 1988. They had Honda engines coming along with Senna from Lotus. With Prost being with McLaren a few years before Senna arrived, he had the advantage of knowing the staff and the processes. With Senna having raced with Honda engines before, he had the advantage of knowing the engineers there and having built their trust. At a pre-season test in Imola, McLaren's laps 2 seconds faster than what Ferrari had done previously. It was evident from there that the 1988 world champion would be a McLaren driver. The only question would be, which one? The season was closely fought and followed a pattern of Senna being quicker in qualifying, with Prost being more consistent in the races, which kept the championship close. The Portuguese Grand Prix was the first real flashpoint between the two. The race was the 13th round of the season, with 3 to go after that. Senna was leading the race and Prost went to overtake him down the pit straight. Senna forced him to the right up against the pit wall. A couple pit crews had to remove their pit boards. That's how close he got squeezed. What he did was inexcusable, said Prost after the race. It was dangerous. If he wants the World Championship that badly, he can have it. It's been said that there was when Prost realised how badly Senna really wanted it. When Senna was in the car, he wanted to win at all costs. Senna had been quick all year, but Prost was the most consistent out of the two. Senna needed only to win in Suzuka to win the championship with a race to spare. Suzuka being in Japan, Honda's home race. With the championship so close, Jean-Marie Balest, president of the governing body of FISA, got involved. Balest, a Frenchman, wrote a letter to Honda's president telling him how important it was to make sure that the drivers had equal equipment for the final 2 races. Balest's letter was implying that Honda had been favouring Senna and giving Prost inferior engines, which is why Senna had proved to be the faster driver. Honda replied in an open letter. It was pinned up in the press room notes board at Suzuka. The letter reassured Formula 1 fans that Honda would supply equal equipment for the last 2 races of the season and not favour one driver. Senna took pole, but it turned out to be his disadvantage as it was situated on the dirty side of the track. Senna stalled at the start with a gearbox issue and managed to get going. He sliced through the field and overtook Prost, who was having the same gearbox issues Senna had. Senna won the race and he won his first ever World Championship. The rivalry continued in 1989 and it took only until the second race of the season for the 2 drivers to fall out again. Prost angrily accusing Senna of breaking a gentleman's agreement not to race each other until after the first corner. With Senna diving down the inside of an open door, Prost left open thinking it wouldn't be attacked. At the next race in Monaco, the 2 drivers stopped talking to each other, and it was Senna who instigated it, no longer referring to Prost by his name, simply referring to Prost as him, or worse. But why was it Senna who instigated it, when it was him who broke the original agreement? Between the 2 rounds, there was a test in Pembrey in Wales. Ron Dennis, Prost and Senna were all there. Prost was still angry. Ron Dennis was a mediator and forced Senna to apologise. Comments from Prost made the press about this test. He called Senna a liar, which Senna didn't like, and from there the 2 drivers could never be the same. Prost announcing at the French Grand Prix he was leaving McLaren due to what he felt was a team favouring Senna. As the championship battle arrived to Suzuka, again the penultimate race of the season, Prost had one hand on the championship. Senna needed 2 wins from the last 2 races to claim the title. Anything else wouldn't do. Senna got pole position, but to Senna's fury, pole position was still not moved away from the dirty side of the track, just like the year before. Prost got the jump at the start and held the lead for the majority of the race. On lap 46, Senna was able to have a shot at victory. He went down the inside of Prost at the chicane, they touched. Prost was out there and then. With the help of the marshals, Senna managed to get going, changing parts in the pits, and back in second place, Senna managed to catch and overtake for the victory. This was huge for his championship chances, but there was more drama to follow. He was immediately disqualified and not allowed to go on the podium. Dangerous driving for cutting out the chicane was cited as the reason. The disqualification meant Prost was champion. Senna saw it as conspiracy, claiming that Jean-Marie Balest was behind the disqualification. McLaren appealed the decision, citing there was no dangerous driving involved. A week after the race, Prost was confirmed as world champion. The disqualification would stand. Senna later saying, "They wanted to disqualify me for whatever reason they could, for whatever argument they could say." During the off-season, it wasn't even sure Senna would be racing in the 1990 season. When McLaren appealed and lost, Senna received an even larger penalty, a 6-month suspended sentence and a $100,000 fine. Senna wasn't having it. He felt the governing body was corrupt and wasn't planning on paying the fine. So Balest raised the stakes. He held a press conference in Paris and dropped a new bombshell. Not only was Senna required to pay a fine, he was also required to apologise in public. If he didn't, he wouldn't receive a super license to take part in the 1990 season. Ron Dennis ended up paying the fine and submitting some form of a statement from Senna that kind of sounded like an apology, without actually directly apologising. It did the trick, and Senna was allowed to race. The 1990 season would be tougher on Senna and McLaren. Both Williams and Ferrari, who Prost now drives for, were fast. Even though they were in different teams, the championship fight was still mainly between Senna and Prost. The season was quite incident-free between the two, and coming into the penultimate race of the season, Senna was ahead of Prost in the championship. As I went into that race, Senna had won 6 of the races that year, one more than Prost had managed. Senna had the advantage. All Senna had to do to win the title was finish ahead of Prost, whereas Prost had to win the race to keep the championship alive. But the race was at Suzuka, again, the Colosseum of the previous season's showdowns. One of the first things Senna did when arriving at the circuit was to check where pole position was. If you remember, he felt it was on the incorrect side of the track for the previous 2 seasons. The officials confirmed to Senna that pole position would be moved to the other side of the track for this year, moving it to the racing line. Senna went out and got pole, and after getting the position, officials informed him that pole position wouldn't be changed after all. Senna was fuming. He blamed Balest, saying at the time, "I did the fantastic job to be on pole. It was important to be on pole for this race." Then what happened? blessed gave an order. He also added, "I tell myself, okay, you try to work clean, you try to do your own job properly, and then you get fucked all the time by stupid people. If on Sunday at the start, because I'm on the wrong place, Prost jumps the start and beats me off the line at the first corner, I'm going for it. And he had better not turn in ahead of me, because he is not going to make it." Sunday arrived, everyone was ready for the race and wondering what would happen. Would the race be clean, or like last year, would Senna and Prost connect with each other? As Senna had feared, Prost made a better start off the grippier part of the track. Senna went into Prost's slipstream and then jumped down the inside, Prost taking the usual racing line. They collided at around 150 miles per hour, both ending up in the gravel trap. Both out of the race there and then. Senna was a new world champion and Prost was fuming. One of the first things Senna's quoted as saying when he arrived back to his garage in Italian was, "There are people winning the championship in a chicane and now won it in a corner." He said it to an Italian journalist. At a press conference after the race, journalists were hostile to Senna, but Senna denied the accident was his fault to the press. He denied all blame. Before the last race of the season, Senna completed a television interview with Jackie Stewart. Stewart is a 3-time world champion who raced in the 60s and 70s, back in a time when drivers used to lose their lives far too often. Stewart knew firsthand the dangers of racing and wasn't impressed with Senna, and he wasn't shy in letting Senna know.
Let me ask you another difficult question. If I were to count back all the world champions, and after all this is the 500th Grand Prix, that if you totaled up all of those great champions, the number of times they had made contact with other drivers, that you in the last 36 months or 48 months have been in contact with more other cars and drivers than they might have done in total.
I find amazing for you to make such a question, Stuart, because you are very experienced and you know a lot about racing. And you should know that by being a racing driver, you are under risk all the time. And by being a racing driver means you are racing with other people. And if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver, because we are competing to win. And the main motivation to all of us is to compete for a victory. It's not to come 3rd, 4th, 5th or 6th.
But hasn't that
right?
always been the case?
Sorry?
Hasn't that always been the case of all the great champions?
Absolutely. And if you go back in history, then you talk about incidents and so on, you'll find that I've been myself leading most of the races and finding back markers in front of me. And I was never involved in leading races and with other people. There were 3-4 events only when I was leading a race in first corner and so on, like many other people have been involved.
I have to believe, though, Ayrton, that there must be some fault, and I respect totally your ability. You're the fastest Grand Prix driver in the world. I respect that. But I have to speculate that it can't all be right, that you have this many collisions, if you like, whether it be with back markers or whether it be with lead changes. It just happens too often. Don't you question yourself?
I think it's all irrelevant. All what you're saying, Jack, is really irrelevant, because I'm a driver that won more races than anybody over the past 3 years. I'm a driver that has been on pole position more than anybody in history. And I'm a driver that won 2 titles in the past 3 years. And I don't think I cannot comprehend how you can try to turn things around to say that I've been involved in more accidents than anybody, because that is not true as well. I don't really understand the point.
No, I'm sorry, I don't agree with that.
Then you should go back. You should go back 10 years from the date of today and look not only the leaders. You should look the middle field and the back field drivers.
I speak of the champions.
And find by yourself that perhaps what you're saying is not quite right.
1 year after this interview, Senna revealed he did intentionally take Prost out, in doing so confirming he wasn't actually going for a gap, like his famous quote implies at the time of saying it. Senna's full quote and admittance, funnily enough, was at Suzuka once again, where he said the following: Senna and Prost's rivalry continued until the end of the 1993 season, after Prost retired from Formula 1. The two of them managed to bury the past and become friends, finally. putting to bed one of the greatest rivalries in Formula One history.